Okay, this is in no way sponsored by the federal government or any government agency ever. I'm just going to be totally clear with that. Because quite frankly, that would be really bad if they thought this was official. Okay, so essentially I'm going to figure out where to stand, but here's probably a good idea. Before I start, the images that I use in this presentation are all licensed Creative Commons, and quite frankly, this presentation would be half as good without the artists that created them, so I do want to take the time to thank those artists. I take a lot of inspiration from imagery in order to put talks together. So I've spent the last 5 years of my career working at the confluence of public policy, people, and in technology, and I've been trying to understand how these things inform one another as both a citizen and as a public servant. And what I've found is that these things are often very complex, very complicated, and quite frankly, often quite confusing. And personally, as a proponent of a more kind of open and agile public sector, I think we're quite literally staring into this chasm. If you've ever read the book Crossing the Chasm, I think that's kind of where we are at. We're looking forward to what the next big thing is. And as a citizen, I'm very eager to cross that. And as a public servant, I'm understanding why public institutions are very reticent to move into that direction. For one, that space is simultaneously filled with the unknown and with opportunity. It's also filled with terror and with excitement. And it's similarly filled with risk and reward. And so what I think we've arrived at is this odd dichotomy where we continue to kind of grow tired of doing business as usual, but we fear the unknown. And so we're in this kind of paralysis state right now. And so, are we okay?
Check the soundboard.
The soundboard at the back? Sorry, do you want me to pause and wait, or are we just going to be going through? A little bit of adversity never hurt anyone, right? So anyway, quite frankly, I think the tension is starting to boil over. We have all kinds of crazy things happening in our streets, and look at what's happened over the last year. Is it my positioning? And so the idea is that, we have riots in places, we have revolutions going on, and we have people occupying our city streets. And so how much longer can we go without a bridge to the next kind of level of what the society is going to look like? And I think that bridge necessarily entails some kind of fundamental rethinking of how the public sector interacts with its citizens. And the reason I think that is because a very brilliant man told us so a very long time ago, that we can't solve the problems using the same kind of thinking that we used when we created them. And yet, if there's anything we are guilty of in the public sector, is holding on to old mental models of what public servants ought to be, what they ought to look like, the kind of solutions that they ought to offer up. And quite frankly, what I want to do is put forth a creative alternative to kind of that status quo. And that creative alternative requires one thing from you, and that requires that you push the stereotype of the paper-pushing, process-focused bureaucrat out of your mind, at least for the next few minutes. And then fill it with something that's inherently different, something that is more humane, something that is web-focused, that is savvy, that is focused on an outcome, and that actually cares about you. Because quite frankly, I think these are the public servants of the future, and I believe that in my heart of hearts, and I've met many of these people along the way, and there are many more of those people stuck in their cubicles waiting for a way out. And what I think that we need to do is rethink and start to reboot government and look at a way that we can actually help them find a way out of that predicament. So the main question is, what does a more open and agile government kind of look like? What does post-bureaucratic government look like? And traditionally, the question seems so large that people tend to, at least the bureaucrats of yesteryear, tend to use the scale of the question, couple it with an ineffective organizational model, and thereby avoid having to actually posit a response. And so what I want to do instead is actually get to that creative action and that response that I think that, the scale of the problem doesn't necessarily mean that we can't posit some kind of creative solution to it. But before I can open that particular can, what I need to do is actually talk about a little bit about the one specific niche in which I want to apply this kind of thinking, and that's in grants and contribution spending. And so for the uninitiated, grants and contributions are simply a tool at the disposition of government, or at the disposal of government rather, that allows them to disperse money into different organizations, community organizations, small businesses, individuals, or other levels of government in order to actually affect a specific outcome. It sounds quite simple, but when you actually look at how it breaks down, it's actually quite complicated in real life. Federally, the federal government in this country spends about $27 billion per year in transfer payments. Provincially in Ontario, that number is $85 billion. At the federal level, that money is managed through through 800 different programs, and provincially I couldn't even ascertain how many programs there were. The throughput of all of this money is actually reported on a quarterly or annual basis on different departmental websites, essentially making cross-cutting analysis difficult, if not impossible, for anyone looking to figure out where the money is actually being spent. And having never applied for government money myself, I wanted to kind of get the applicant side of things. So what I did was sit down with business owners, charities, researchers, and small organizations that have applied for grant money. And what they did was they all told me different stories, but there's a few disturbing trends that came out through all of these different interviews. The first is that most had to hire intermediaries. They had to hire consultants to navigate the process because they couldn't figure it out themselves. It was quite frankly too complex to get from point A to point B. The second is that the cost of actually applying for the grant money far outweighed the benefit. So they had to divert labor away from core business to chase the grant money, which meant they couldn't accomplish their core business anymore. The third is that the entire process was on lockdown from the get-go. They had no idea who they were competing with for money, if they were going to be successful. Basically, it was kind of you put something in and a few months later you hear something back. Fourth, that the process itself was always adversarial. That bureaucrats on the other side of the money fence were simply acting as gatekeepers, looking to check boxes and hand out money once those boxes were checked. No one dealt with an active steward who said, I want the best return on investment of these government monies, so I'm going to pick amongst the best types of projects. And the last one is that there's no respect for timelines. Many of these organizations live hand to mouth, and so the slowness of government actually slows down or stops the effectiveness of an organization altogether. So I want to revisit my initial question, which is what does a more open and agile government look like in the specific context of grants and contributions money? And what I think it does is I think it starts to shatter all of the traditional trade-offs. Making money contingent on hiring intermediaries, for example, diverting labor away from core business, being left out of the process, meeting minimum thresholds set by government, or moving, like my mother says, at the speed of molasses in the month of January, if anyone still eats molasses. And what I think it also does is it moves everything into kind of this single window that's online, that's client-focused and not government-focused. And in that window, information is easy to access, and search is a central part of this. And so you can look at examples like the city of Calgary, for example. It would be a great example of putting search first in the portal. The system also should make recommendations to citizens, much like Amazon makes recommendations to clients. Groups, if you applied for this grant, you might also want to apply for this one. If you've spoken to this public official, you might also want to speak to this one. Application criteria should be clearly articulated and uniformly presented, as opposed to a mishmash of 800 different application forms. And the data should follow the user, so there's a certain input of tombstone data that follows the applicant from point A to point B as they navigate the system. It should also include examples of what's successful and unsuccessful. Someone told me that they went to a workshop on grants and contributions, but the government agent refused to show them examples of a successful application. They only showed them ones that didn't get through. There should be an online active support mechanism, but not just government supporting citizens, but citizens interacting with each other and supporting each other because they have something to learn if they've applied to the same grant. But also government can be in that space to learn from citizens to streamline their delivery and maybe produce a more effective set of FAQs. It could actually start to pair people based on interesting markers like geography, proximity, the type of money that they've applied for, or the public servant that they worked with. It should also include persistent online identities for public officials who work with applicants and that lists their expertise and makes that expertise more widely available to applicants so they understand. I think it should connect citizens directly with one another or groups that are vying for the same limited pool of grant money so that they understand who they're up against. It can provide them the necessary information on whether or not they need to abandon their bid halfway through because a competitor's bid is way better. They could team up with a competitor if they're actually trying to achieve a similar goal. Or they can decide simply to go head-to-head with them for the cash if they think they're going to win. Imagine the types of efficiencies that you can create in the charitable sector or the not-for-profit sector by linking people up with similar mission statements who are already competing for the same money. Or bringing small businesses together who work in the similar sector. Think about the innovation that could create in a city like Ottawa. It should also allow citizens to easily leverage their existing social networks and to gain support, insight, criticism, or measure sentiment around their applications. Think about two different groups competing for monies to build an infrastructure project like a hockey rink or a new road, what two of those things are more important to a particular community? I think the community has something to probably do to say about that. In this role, government acts as a convener. It brings people together and starts to involve citizens in for public consultation as it makes sense, specifically targeting people based on geography or other markers where it makes sense. And I don't think this necessarily constitutes a tyranny of the majority. We wouldn't vote up putting beer in water fountains, for example. There's still a role for public servants to play. They still need to bring their expertise to bear, evaluate ideas, and make recommendations to the elected officials who ultimately decide where those funds will be spent. Whenever the threshold for approval is met, and I don't just mean government threshold, I mean when the community is on board and when the government's on board or when the organizations all agree, the government can work with the recipient organization to actually transfer those funds in a clear and transparent manner that's effective, that meets the timelines and the desires of the organization. And then the government can then actually spend the time to evaluate and measure the actual outcomes against the stated ones in the application, which would produce an entirely large piece of data. And we could finally find the droids that we're looking for. But governments could share that data that they collect in the exact same distribution window. And if you think about it, what you're doing is coupling current applications with previous data, the data generated in previous applications, which provides some really neat, interesting analysis that can be done by applicants. Government can even go so far as providing the tools that manipulate the data for citizens in order for them to do the analysis, because not everyone has access to what they need, to the tools or technology they need to actually manipulate the data. And data literacy becomes a part of that as well. If they're unwilling to provide the tools, government could create an incentive structure whereby entrepreneurs could build applications or visualizations around the data so we could better understand where federally, say, $27 billion goes, or provincially where $85 billion per annum goes. In short, keeping the data all together and making it accessible means it can help inform anyone who chooses to look at it, be it applicants, be it citizens, be it the media doing investigative journalism, public servants who need to make recommendations, or politicians who need to make decisions. But I honestly think that this is just the beginning. It's a starting point for a conversation that I hope to continue. And if we don't continue that conversation, I'm not sure who's going to. And I'd be remiss to not conclude on a point about resisting the coming change. And I actually don't think we can afford to resist the change anymore. I think if we don't look at the new technologies and how they're affecting the global society, we're going to be remiss, and it's going to lead us down a dark path. Down a path that I, for one, will be sorry, I think, to go down, one where public institutions fail to use the web and the technology available to build a better relationship between citizens and their public institutions, because the next generation of citizens are digital, and those digital citizens will, quite frankly, have the world in the palm of their hands. Thank you.